today's stories, we follow these Karens who tried climbing Everest with ego, from firing their Sherpas for giving safety warnings, to refusing turnaround calls so reckless they left even veteran guides stunned. The outcomes that followed were so horrifying that they left the people who witnessed them permanently changed. It was May 6th, 2016, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet was entering the final stretch before the spring summit window. 14 commercial expeditions filled the tent city across the Khumbu Glacier, prayer flags snapping above cook tents where juniper smoke mixed with a mineral bite of glacial ice. Morning temperatures hovered near 18 degrees Fahrenheit, warming into the low 30s by afternoon. Radios crackled with weather data and rotation schedules, and every conversation carried the same undercurrent. The window was close. Among those preparing was Linda Hargrove, a 52-year-old from Scottsdale, Arizona, who had retired 3 years earlier from a senior director role at a pharmaceutical distribution company. 26 years of managing national sales territories had built a personality that treated timelines as non-negotiable and pushback as a problem to be escalated. She had climbed Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, both guided, both successful, and both reinforcing a belief that preparation and persistence were the only variables that mattered. She paid $68,000 to a mid-tier Nepali operator and arrived at base camp with a personal itinerary, mapping every rotation and summit date against historical weather averages she had compiled herself. Her assigned Sherpa was Kancha Wongdi, 41, from Tame Village, a veteran of 11 Everest summits across 18 seasons. His reputation among operators was built on reading clients accurately and managing the ones who confused paying for a summit attempt with purchasing a guaranteed outcome. His income supported his wife, 3 children, and his elderly mother, whose diabetes medication consumed a growing share of what he earned each season. The friction began at the first acclimatization briefing, when Linda interrupted expedition leader Prakash Tamang 3 times to propose schedule modifications, compressing rest days, skipping a night at Camp 1, adjusting departure times based on her research. Prakash explained that acclimatization was physiological, not logistical. Linda accepted this the way she had accepted budget limitations at work, as a starting point for negotiation. Through rotations, the pattern solidified. Linda treated Kancha's guidance as input to be evaluated against her own research rather than expertise to be followed. She pushed ahead of his pace in the icefall, countered his hydration recommendations with her own supplement schedule, and questioned whether his pulse oximeter had been calibrated when it showed 70% saturation at Camp 3. Each correction was delivered with the certainty of someone who believed she had already accounted for every variable. The dynamic wore on Kancha in ways that accumulated rather than peaked. He had guided clients who were afraid, clients who were overconfident, and clients who treated him as invisible. Linda was something different, someone who believed she had already accounted for every variable and viewed his experience as redundant information. Before the summit push, Linda requested assurance from Prakash that the turnaround time, 1 p.m., regardless of position, could be adjusted based on conditions. Prakash told her it was non-negotiable. Linda accepted this verbally. Her behavior on summit night suggested otherwise. They departed Camp 4 on May 18th at 11 p.m. under clear skies. Linda climbed steadily through the first hours, slower than the team average but consistent enough that Kancha allowed himself cautious optimism. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, her pace collapsed. 15 steps, then a 2-minute rest, then 10 steps and longer pauses. By 1 p.m. they had reached approximately 28,500 feet with a turnaround hitting. Kancha told her directly they needed to descend. Linda pointed upward. The summit was visible and continued climbing without acknowledging the instruction. Her voice was flat, her gestures delayed. Kancha checked her saturation. 59%. The woman making the decision to continue was no longer functioning clearly enough to make it. 1 p.m. passed. Linda kept climbing. Around 3:30 p.m., at approximately 28,700 feet, she sat down on the track and stopped responding entirely. Her eyes were open, but tracked nothing. Her hands rested in her lap without coordination to adjust her mask. The cerebral edema had progressed past the point of participation. Kancha began lowering her, clipping her harness to the fixed line, managing dead weight through technical terrain as temperatures dropped toward -35 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The work required removing his outer gloves repeatedly to manage carabiners with the precision the terrain demanded. For 2 hours he worked alone before a Sherpa team from Camp 4 met him and helped bring her down. Linda Hargrove was pronounced dead at Camp 4. The cause was high-altitude cerebral edema, compounded by hypothermia. Kancha reached camp with severe frostbite on 7 fingers and all 10 toes, the result of hours of bare-handed rope work in extreme cold. Doctors in Kathmandu amputated portions of 3 fingers and 2 toes. The damage ended his ability to grip ice tools or wear crampon-compatible boots for extended climbing. He returned to Tem and took work managing a lodge. His guiding career was over at 41. It was April 28, 2013, and the route between Camp 1 and Camp 2 crossed the western Sea of Uum, a broad glacial valley that turned into a solar oven by mid-morning as sunlight reflected off the ice walls of Noptse and Lhotse. The traverse gained minimal elevation, but stretched for miles across crevasses, hidden by thin snow bridges. Morning cold gave way to temperatures past 40 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sun, accelerating dehydration at 20,000 feet. Diane Buckley, 49, from Naples, Florida, had joined the expedition as part of a post-divorce reinvention. She had sold her share of a real estate development company and was spending a portion of the proceeds on experiences that proved she was more than what her marriage had reduced her to. Her mountaineering experience consisted of a guided luxury Kilimanjaro trek the previous year. She paid $72,000 to a well-known Western operator. Her Sherpa was Pemba Katar, 37, from Pangbosh, steady, careful, with 9 Everest summits and a reputation for managing high-maintenance clients without losing patience. He was the sole provider for his wife, 2 young sons, and his mother. Diane's complaints began before leaving base camp. Tent placement too close to the latrine area, cook tent menu lacking options she could eat, sleeping bag rated for conditions she didn't believe she would encounter. Each was delivered with the assumption that staff existed to accommodate preferences rather than manage logistics under extreme constraints. When Sawyer explained that tent placement was determined by terrain stability, Diane accepted the answer temporarily before raising the same issue through a different framing the following day. But the problem that killed her was smaller than any of those complaints and had been flagged repeatedly. During equipment checks, Pemba noticed Diane consistently loosened her climbing harness after putting it on, adjusting the leg loops and waist belt until comfortable rather than secure. He corrected her twice that first day, demonstrating proper fit, snug enough that 2 fingers could slide beneath the waist belt, but not a fist. Diane tightened it under supervision and loosened it within minutes. The pattern repeated at every camp. When Pemba explained that a loose harness could fail to arrest a fall on steep terrain, Diane said the straps created pressure points. Expedition leader Brett Sawyer instructed her directly that harness fit was a safety requirement. Diane adjusted it in his presence and was observed loosening it 30 minutes later. On May 3rd, during the second rotation on the Lhotse face, the harness issue reached its conclusion. The route angled between 40 and 50 degrees on blue ice, fixed ropes providing the safety margin for less experienced climbers. At approximately 23,000 feet, Diane's left crampon scraped across hard water ice without catching. Her boots skated out, and her body weight transferred to the Jumar on the fixed rope, which should have held her in position while she regained footing. Instead, the loosened waist belt rode upward under load. The leg loops failed to distribute weight properly. Diane's body rotated and partially inverted before the Jumar held. Pemba was 15 feet below. He climbed toward her immediately, reaching her within 2 minutes. But the angle and her position made rescue complicated. He needed to support her weight while she righted herself. Except Diane was panicking, her movements erratic, legs kicking at the ice instead of finding the purchase. The harness shifted again. The waist belt, now near her rib cage, no longer held her center of gravity. Her body began sliding through the loosened webbing. Pemba grabbed for her jacket, her harness, but the fabric slipped through his gloves as her weight overcame the friction of loose straps. Diane Buckley fell approximately 700 feet down the Lhotse face and died on impact. Pemba, who had lunged to catch her, was pulled off balance, his right shoulder dislocated violently, and the jolt swung him into the ice face, fracturing 3 ribs. He hung on the fixed rope until a Sherpa from another team helped stabilize him. The shoulder required surgery. The ribs healed but left chronic pain during heavy exertion. He never climbed above base camp again. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. It was May 11th, 2017, and Camp 2 at 21,200 feet sat in the western CWM, surrounded by the walls of Nuptse and Lhotse that reflected sound and light until the space felt compressed despite its scale. Teams clustered in small tent villages, climbers spending rest days hydrating and studying weather forecasts that would determine when they went higher. Margaret Sinclair, 44, from Denver, Colorado, had come to Everest better read than almost anyone in her expedition, and less prepared than she believed. She had consumed every major Everest book published in the previous 2 decades, referencing them with precision that other climbers found initially impressive and eventually exhausting. She had climbed Rainier twice and Elbrus once, experiences that gave her familiarity with crampons, but nothing approaching an 8,000-meter peak. She paid $65,000 to a reputable Western-led expedition. Her Sherpa was Thendup Gyaltsen, 36, from Namche Bazaar. Quiet, technically excellent, with 7 Everest summits and the calm that came from having seen enough emergencies to know which he could fix and which he could only survive. He supported his wife, a young son, and contributed to his nephew's school fees after his brother's death in a trekking accident. Margaret's defining behavior was correction. She corrected Thendup on Serac names in the icefall, on details of the 1996 disaster, on pacing strategy based on physiological studies she had read. Each correction carried the implication that her research superseded his direct observation. Thendup handled it by framing recommendations as observations rather than instructions, a strategy that worked until altitude began revealing what books could not teach. During the 3rd rotation, her oxygen saturation dropped to 66% at Camp 3. Her breathing had developed a faint wet quality, a subtle crackling on deep exhales that Thendup recognized as the earliest sign of fluid accumulating in the lungs. He told her directly that the sound suggested beginning stages of high-altitude pulmonary edema and recommended immediate descent. Margaret dismissed it, citing a medical text about the difficulty of distinguishing early HOP from upper respiratory infection without imaging. Expedition leader James Halloran heard the same crackling and recommended descent. Margaret attributed it to a cold and descended the following morning as scheduled, but the lung damage had already begun accumulating. The summit push launched May 19th. At Camp 4, Margaret's breathing was audible without a stethoscope, a continuous wet undertone, worsening with exertion. Saturation on supplemental oxygen read 63%. Thendup told Halloran she should not go higher. Margaret insisted the numbers were within the range she had researched. They departed at 11 p.m. By the balcony, her rest stops had doubled, and the wet sound had become a rattling other climbers could hear passing. Thendup told her they were turning around. Margaret continued without acknowledging him. Above 28,000 feet, the pulmonary edema overwhelmed her. Margaret stopped on the fixed line and began coughing. Deep, wet coughs producing pink-tinged sputum visible in headlamp light. The fluid was actively drowning her from the inside, and no amount of supplemental oxygen could overcome it. Within 30 minutes, she could no longer stand. Within an hour, she was barely conscious, breathing reduced to shallow, gurgling efforts. Margaret Sinclair died at approximately 27,800 feet around 5 a.m. on May 20th, fluid filling her lungs until oxygen could no longer reach her blood. Thendup descended alone, physically uninjured but carrying the weight of having identified the exact danger, communicated it clearly, and been overruled by someone who believed research was a substitute for judgment. He completed the season but declined his contract for the following year. He took work managing equipment logistics for a trekking company in Namche, a position that kept him in the mountains but off the routes where his recommendations could be dismissed by someone who had read more books than he had. It was May 5th, 2013, and the Khumbu icefall was groaning in the pre-dawn cold. Deep, structural sounds that traveled through the ice, like warnings the glacier issued to anyone willing to listen. The route wound through shifting seracs and crevasses, bridged by aluminum ladders, and teams moved through before dawn, knowing every minute between collapsing ice towers was borrowed from probability. Patricia Holloway, 47, from Charlotte, North Carolina, had built a real estate development company from a single property into a firm managing $180 million in assets. She was accustomed to environments where her authority was absolute, and questioning her judgment was treated as a performance issue. Her only mountaineering experience was Kilimanjaro the previous year. She paid $70,000 to a Nepali operator whose vetting process failed to distinguish between underqualified and willing to pay enough to make the question irrelevant. Her Sherpa was Lakpa Jangbu, 43, from Forts, 13 Everest summits across 20 years, known for being direct, competent, and unwilling to let clients override safety calls regardless of payment. That directness had cost him assignments before. It had also kept every client he guided alive. His income supported his wife, 4 children, and the community school in Forts. The conflict was immediate. Patricia interpreted safety guidance as insubordination. When Lakpa set a pace through the icefall, she considered slow. She told him to move faster. When he explained that pace was determined by conditions and teams ahead, she told him his job was to support her goals, not manage her expectations. At Camp 2, when Lakpa recommended an extra rest day based on her 72% saturation, Patricia told expedition leader Dawa Nuru that Lakpa was undermining her confidence. She requested a different Sherpa. Dawa spoke with Lakpa privately. Lakpa told him Patricia was not ready for the upper mountain. Dawa faced the familiar calculation: a paying client with signed waivers versus an experienced guide whose assessment was probably correct but whose removal was simpler than the argument. Dawa reassigned Lakpa and replaced him with Ong Chering, a 26-year-old assistant on his 3rd Everest season. Ong Chering had 2 summits and solid skills, but lacked the years that told older guides when a situation was heading toward a disaster. The reassignment sent a clear message to every Sherpa on the team: the client's preference outranked the guide's judgment. Lakpa returned to base camp and waited. On summit night, Lakpa stood outside his tent and watched the chain of headlamps moving up the southeast ridge in the dark. He could not tell which light was Patricia's. He didn't need to. He already knew how the night would end for a client whose replacement guide had been chosen for compliance rather than experience. The summit push departed Camp 4 on May 18th at 11 p.m. Patricia climbed slowly through the lower southeast ridge, pace dropping above the balcony as coordination declined. Ong Chering adjusted oxygen and encouraged her when she hesitated, trained to support rather than override. By 2 a.m., the weather began shifting. Cloud thickened from the southwest faster than forecast, wind increasing from manageable to concerning within an hour. Experienced teams turned around. Ong Chering told Patricia they should consider descending. Patricia refused. At approximately 28,400 feet, visibility collapsed into a whiteout, driven by 50-mile-per-hour gusts. Patricia became disoriented immediately, drifting off the fixed line towards the east, where the Kangshung face dropped 10,000 feet into Tibet. Ong Chering corrected her course twice, physically guiding her back. During a sustained gust, Patricia unclipped from the fixed line. Whether intentionally to adjust gear or through cognitive failure is impossible to determine. Without the rope, she wandered from the track within minutes. Ong Chering searched the immediate area in driving snow, but visibility made it impossible. He followed the fixed line to Camp 4, arriving hypothermic and distressed. Patricia Holloway was found 4 days later, approximately 300 feet east of the standard route, seated in the snow. She had frozen to death in the whiteout, less than an hour's walk from the fixed line in clear conditions. Lakpa Jangbu volunteered for the recovery team. During the lowering at 27,000 feet, a section of old fixed rope failed under load, swinging him into a rock outcrop. The impact hyperextended his left knee and tore the ligaments. Surgery in Kathmandu repaired the worst damage, but the knee could not tolerate sustained load-bearing at altitude. Lakpa retired from expedition work at 43 and took a position, training young guides in Forts, teaching them, among other things, how to manage the clients who believed money replaced the judgment it was meant to support. It was May 9th, 2018, and the tension at base camp had shifted from preparation to anticipation. Weather models were converging on a window between May 14th and 16th, and every conversation carried the anxious energy of climbers who had spent weeks acclimatizing and were facing the narrow period that justified the investment. Suzanne Keller, 51, from Westchester, New York, had a specific reason for needing the earliest summit date. 3 months before departure, she had announced at a charity gala before 400 guests that she would summit Everest on May 15th to raise funds for her children's school scholarship program. The date was now fixed in dozens of social media posts, a fundraising page, and the expectations of a community she could not disappoint. Her resume consisted of Kilimanjaro and a Cho Oyu attempt that ended at Camp 2. She paid $75,000 and trained 18 months with a personal altitude fitness coach, the most thorough preparation possible without actually spending extended time at extreme altitude, which was exactly the limitation training could not overcome. Her Sherpa was Mingma Thendu, 39, from the upper Rollwailing Valley, methodical, soft-spoken, with 8 Everest summits and a cautious approach shaped by a valley where the consequences of poor judgment were visible in every generation. He supported his wife, 2 children, and his aging father, whose deteriorating eyesight required ongoing treatment in Kathmandu. Suzanne was not aggressive. She did not berate or demean. What she did was treat the mountain as subordinate to her schedule. Every conversation about conditions or timing returned to May 15th, when Mingma recommended an extra rest day because her saturation at Camp 3 read 68%. Suzanne responded with calm insistence that the timeline could not change because people were counting on her. Mingma understood the pressure. He also understood the mountain could not read fundraising pages. He conveyed his concerns to expedition leader David Reinhardt, who agreed her numbers were marginal, but noted the final decision rested with the client. They departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 14th under cooperative conditions. Suzanne reached the balcony around 3 a.m. without major incident. Above it, wind increased and cloud built from the south, not catastrophic, but the kind of marginal deterioration that turned manageable into dangerous. Several teams turned around. Mingma told Suzanne the weather was deteriorating and they should descend. She refused. She had committed publicly to May 15th. Turning around was not an option she could accept. She summited at approximately 11:40 a.m., late by any standard, dangerously late by Everest standards. Mingma documented the moment and immediately directed her downward. The descent destroyed her. The wind had strengthened to sustain gusts above 40 miles per hour, driving spindrift that reduced visibility to body lengths. Suzanne's pace, already slow on the ascent, collapsed entirely. She stopped every few steps, her body visibly failing as exhaustion and hypoxia compounded with every meter of lost altitude that came too late to reverse what the summit had cost. The oxygen that had sustained her on the way up was running low, and the cold was deepening toward -40 °F with wind chill. Below the south summit, Suzanne sat down and stopped. Mingma treed for 20 minutes to get her standing, adjusting oxygen, checking her mask, speaking with the steady urgency of someone who had seen this progression before. She was conscious but vacant, the person inside retreating from the cold, an effort her training had not prepared her for. Suzanne Keller died on the upper southeast ridge during the afternoon of May 15th, the date she had promised 400 people she would summit. The cause was exhaustion, hypothermia, and hypoxia. Her body could no longer fight. She had reached the summit and been unable to survive the cost of getting there. Mingma spent 4 additional hours in the death zone before a Sherpa team confirmed what he already knew: the repeated bearskin contact required to manage oxygen equipment and carabiners in extreme cold had destroyed tissue in his hands beyond recovery. Surgeons in Kathmandu amputated portions of 4 fingers across both hands. Without reliable grip strength for ice tools and fixed rope hardware, Mingma Thendu's career at extreme altitude was over. He returned to Rollwailing and took work coordinating logistics for trekking groups at elevations that no longer asked his hands for what they could no longer give. 5 cairns, 1 mountain, 5 Sherpas who identified the danger, communicated it clearly, and were overruled by women who believed that payment, preparation, or sheer stubbornness could override what the mountain had already decided. Everest collected every debt. It always does. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.